You are listening to Health Science Radio, a podcast from the historic Fitzsimmons Building at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. We talk with our researchers who are searching for answers to some of the biggest challenges across the spectrum of healthcare. Our scientists explore tomorrow's medicine today. On this episode, we talk with Cristin Welle, Associate Professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, with joint appointments in the Department of Neurosurgery and the Department of Physiology and Biophysics. Welle talks about the technology breakthroughs that are driving brain-computer interfaces, including the recent human clinical trial by Neuralink, a company founded by Elon Musk. Welle explains why the field of neurotechnology is taking off and shares some of her lab's efforts to improve the lives of patients with different neurologic conditions.
Welcome to Health Science Radio, and we have a special episode this week where we'll be talking with an expert in neurology, neurosurgery, and physiology and biophysics, Dr. Cristin Welle, who will share her expertise on a topic that's been in the news a great deal lately, brain-computer interface.
I've been following it, both kind of on the popular press and also in some of the scientific press. I think it's a very interesting area, and it's quite scientific, actually.
And another aspect that we have to talk about just before we jump in is that I'm very excited to share with you that we have new theme, or intro and outro music for our Health Science Radio podcast.
Outro music. That's a whole new thing. Well, that's great. We've got intro, we've got outro music. You and your ukulele, or this is different?
No, this would be different. We're featuring a band now that's given us permission to use a song of theirs. The band's called Low. They're an indie rock band out of your home state, Minnesota,
Fantastic.
The Gopher State.
I like it already.
I think you'll like it. It has features prominently a nice bit of keyboard at the beginning, a nice bit of drums, which have kind of a heartbeat rhythm, which coincides with our great graphic done by Jenny Merchant here in the office. And then a nice kind of guitar groove.
Very much looking forward to it.
Oh, terrific. I'm sure
Intro and outro, the whole thing.
Intro and outro. With that bit of news out of the way, we will jump right in here. So as I said, our guest today is Dr. Cristin Welle. Dr. Welle is a systems neurophysiologist with expertise in the interaction between medical devices and the nervous system. She completed her PhD in 2010 from the University of Pennsylvania and then started the Neural Interfaces program at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health Office of Science and Engineering Labs. She helped craft the FDA guidance on brain-computer implants. In 2016, she joined the Faculty of Neurosurgery and Physiology and Biophysics here at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Welle.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Love having you here. And
great to have you here. This is a really neat and interesting topic.
Cristin, you, with your appointments here at the School of Medicine, you span a lot of territory between neurosurgery and physiology and biophysics. And so to me, that seems like two complex worlds, a foot in both. Could you explain what drew you to pursue both of those fields?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I'm in a really privileged position to be able to have one foot in the clinical realm with my position in neurosurgery, and then one foot in the basic neuroscience and physiology realm in physiology. And that really kind of spans my research program very well, because what I'm interested in is understanding how neurotechnology and devices that interact with the nervous system, how they can be used to drive plasticity in the nervous system. And I want to not only understand the effects, like what kind of a difference can we make in the lives of patients? How can we help people to recover from neurologic injury? But I also want to understand why. Like, why does this happen? How can this kind of technology really make these sort of changes in the human nervous system? And so I run a lab that primarily is preclinical. And so we're using advanced neuroscience techniques to explore the why of why neurotechnology works. But we also are transitioning into running clinical trials to see if some of our new findings that we found in our preclinical work can really translate into the clinic and make a difference in the lives of patients.
If we had interviewed you when you first came to CWAN Shoots many years ago and asked you to think forward to 2024, would the person at that point be surprised where we are today in terms of Neuralink and these new developments?
Oh, yeah. There's been a lot happening in this space, a huge amount of changes, both in the academic side, amazing advances in our neuroscience and technology development. There's been huge changes in the commercial side. There's a plethora of companies. Back when I started, there was really just one company that was making technologies for brain-computer interfaces in humans. Now there's probably close to a dozen for implanted technologies. And even at the FDA, the number of device reviewers that are looking at neurotechnology, I would say, has at least quadrupled since the time that I began at FDA. And the reason for that is because this field is growing so rapidly, and there's just been a burst of activity over the last decade or so. Yeah, it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be in this space, and I think we're really just at the beginning, at the advent of this. Like it's gonna continue to grow.
What do you attribute to that growth, Cristin? Is it things like Elon Musk's endeavor with Neuralink and all the attention that's receiving, or is it was this just going to be a natural progression anyway?
Yeah, I think the reason that Elon wanted to be in this space is because of how exciting it was. I don't think he caused the growth. It was already growing and changing quite a bit and very rapidly. And why is that? It's because the brain is like the final frontier of human health. We understand a lot about the body and physiology. We know a lot about the heart and how many of the organs function, but the brain is in many ways still a mystery. And so really understanding how it works, what makes us human, what causes us to have different types of neurologic conditions and how we can solve those is in some ways in its infancy, but is being explored more and more every day.
I wonder if I could just ask kind of a table-setting question. So if you just for the people listening to this, what are the basics that we're talking about here? What are these implantables? Yeah. What types of them are? How many are there? How are they being placed in the brain? Just that high level for the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I've talked about the field of neurotechnology, and so that's a broader field. It encompasses brain-computer interfaces, but it also encompasses things like deep brain stimulators that can help patients with Parkinson's or vagus nerve stimulators that can be used to treat epilepsy. But if we look just at brain-computer interfaces, the goal of that technology is simply, it's to read people's minds. It's to put electrodes in or near the brain to listen to the chatter that's happening all of the time between the neurons, which are the cells that are in the brain. They're talking to each other constantly using electrical signaling. And so you can put an electrode in or near the brain, listen to those signals, those conversations, and use complicated mathematical formulas, computer algorithms to decode what those neurons are saying, and then can use that to help drive different types of external devices. So for instance, patients with brain-computer interface technology right now often are tetraplegic, so they have paralysis of all of their extremities, and these devices are implanted into their brain and can then, the signals these devices are listening to can be used to do things like have the patients control a cursor on a computer screen or control a robotic arm. It's a really amazing, almost a little bit sci-fi kind of space. Like here we are, we're letting people control devices with their mind, essentially. But it's an amazing advance for these patients who really, have lost that ability to physically interact with their external world.
I'm an oncologist by training, a cancer doctor, but thinking back to my neurology training many, many years ago, there's these two functions, right? There's the input to the brain and the output. And so what's happened when someone has a tetraplegia, so they're not able to use their limbs, that outgoing signal has nowhere to go or it's been interrupted. Right. So I think what you're saying these devices are doing then is taking that signal and using an adjunct then, so to speak, to allow them to be received, those signals.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. Exactly. It's like, using the signals that the brain can still generate, but just they no longer can be used to control the body. So this is allowing the patients to use those signals to control something else instead. Yeah,
and you mentioned being used in tetraplegic patients. So that's kind of a good way to transition into this first in human trial, if you'd like, with Neuralink. Their P1, I believe they're calling the patient. He had the brain implant put in fairly recently. I'm just curious, Cristin, do you have any, from your vantage point and having been at the FDA, do you have any concerns about how that first-in-human trial rolled out, or any due diligence aspects to this? Because that is a big leap forward.
It is a big leap forward, yeah. So I think that the Neuralink patient, Nolan, has been implanted for a little over 100 days, and there's been some really cool interviews with him. He seems to be really enjoying the process from what we can tell from social media, and has a lot of new capabilities to control computer cursors, play video games, which is really exciting. So, I think it is a breakthrough, but, from kind of taking a step back, brain-computer interface systems have been implanted in patients for over 2 decades. So fundamentally, this isn't a new breakthrough in that sense. The first patient report was published in the early 2000s. And since then, patients have been able to do things like control computer cursors and play video games, et cetera, in the 2 decades since then. So, there's been a lot of work building up to this moment that, Neuralink is sort of relying on and building upon. And they're not the only company doing this. There are a number of other companies in this space who are making really interesting and novel technology. Neuralink has the street cred of being backed by Elon Musk, and so that's always exciting and generates a lot of buzz. And obviously what they're doing is exciting and really interesting, but should be taken in the context of the fact that fundamentally this has been going on for a couple of decades.
Yeah, and in that light, it's an important point to make about the history of the field. What is unique in your view of what Neuralink is adding to the field scientifically?
Yeah. So what Neuralink essentially did is they took a lot of really cutting-edge ideas from the academic community, and they poured a bunch of money into their company. And so they were able to integrate some new technological innovations that haven't been used before in humans. And these include the electrodes that are being put into the brain of patients are really flexible and really tiny. So previously, the electrodes that were being put in were pretty small, but they were rigid. And you think of maybe the brain as just sort of sitting there inside your skull, not moving around a lot, but actually every time your heart beats, your brain moves quite a bit. There's a lot of movement in the brain. And so there was actually some concerns that have been developing over time that perhaps having a rigid device in the brain that's always moving leads to sort of a mismatch in that stiff material of the electrode and the soft moving material of the brain. And so Neuralink sourced some ideas from academia about how to develop ultra-thin, flexible electrodes, and they're the first to get FDA approval to put a soft technology into human patients. So that's pretty cool. It's an advance. The other things that they've done is they built a new surgical robot that lets them put in these flexible electrodes. And surgical robots are an exciting space for a number of different types of surgeries, including brain surgery. But they developed one that's really specialized for putting these electrodes in. And then finally, their system is fully implanted. So some other systems, the subjects, the users have to go into the clinic, back to the hospital or the outpatient clinic, and kind of get physically connected to these external devices that let the system work. Neuralink system is fully self-contained, it's fully implanted. Nolan can use this at home. And that's a really cool new breakthrough as well.
In a recent tweet, I saw that Elon Musk mentioned that he thinks long-term it'd be possible to just shunt the signals from the brain motor cortex past the damaged part of the spine, and thereby allowing even greater capabilities, perhaps, with the implants. Could you
I'd be happy to speak to that. And I mean, this is a great idea, but Elon Musk didn't come up with it. In fact, it's been done a couple of times by some other research groups. And we actually just had on campus Balu Ajaboya from Case Western Reserve University, who is one of the leaders in this space. And so a few years ago, he published a paper where they used a brain-computer interface and extracted signals and then fed that information back into stimulating electrodes in a patient's muscles and nerves in the arm. So the patient who was fully tetraplegic was able to reanimate their arms and reach and grab a cup and bring it up to their mouth and take a sip. So it is a cool idea, and it would be great if Neuralink is moving in this direction, because I think that the more ideas and investment resources that go into making these kind of solutions for patients, the faster we'll get to something that could be commercially available.
One technical question, and I just don't know the answer to this. So this is a fully implantable device. It's self-contained. It doesn't require a power source per se, or it does? And
it does, yeah. So it's rechargeable and can transmit through the scalp. So it is fully self-contained, but does very much require that recharging, and also the data transmission can be sort of transmitted through the skull so that researchers can see what's really going on and happening. There's huge breakthroughs in technology, and it's interesting how some of this medical technology really ties into different types of fields like computer science and AI, and even your iPhone, right? Like all of these miniaturized, extremely high-performance electronics that are being made for the commercial market for different applications, so people can play really fast and really complex, video games and your iPhone and other applications. Those technological advances then make things like these really advanced brain-computer interfaces possible. So those kind of hardware are being used for these types of applications.
It seems almost like the sky could be the limit here. Like even possibly, I've read that perhaps somebody who has vision issues or maybe blind, perhaps, this kind of technology could maybe restore sight. Is it going that direction?
It certainly could. Again, there has been some of that work done. There was a company called Second Sight. And in fact, on our campus, we hosted some of the clinical trials that allowed this product to be commercialized onto the market. And this was a ultra-thin, high-density electrode array that was situated on the retina and was able to restore some amount of vision to patients. That product's not on the market anymore, but there is a lot of interest in, and there are other companies that are moving in that direction to restore vision either in the eye or in the brain, in the visual centers of the brain. So yeah, I absolutely think it is a possibility. But I do want to just kind of take a step back and say that although this technology is extremely exciting, there is a reason that it's been in development for 2 decades and it's still not going into patients, right? And that's because there's a few reasons. One is that this technology, it's hard to make and it doesn't last that long. The brain is actually kind of a harsh environment. It's very hot. Like, think about putting your iPhone in a bucket of salt water that's at body temperature, 98 degrees, that's sloshing around all of the time. Like, it's not going to last very long, right? So it's actually a pretty difficult environment for these ultra-fine microelectrodes to live in. So there are problems with the longevity of these devices. And in fact, in a recent blog post, Neuralink admitted that some of their electrodes have not stayed in the brain. They've actually popped up out of the brain, which points to potentially a limitation of this very soft, very flexible modality that they're exploring, and something that they might need to kind of go back a little bit to the drawing board to see if they can find a way to make sure that their electrodes can actually stay in the brain for a longer period of time. While this is very exciting, I think we've got a ways to go before this is something that can really be commercialized to patients.
Yeah, I think I might have read a comment that you made in the media that even, this is along the lines of what you're talking about, even brain fluids pose the risk of maybe eating away at the insulation
That's right.
of these devices,
Yeah.
causing them to not operate. Correct.
Yeah, exactly. The insulation, which of course is really important because electronics don't like fluid, right? So you need something to keep those electronics from getting wet. The insulation is essentially a plastic. Different types of plastics are explored as insulation, polymers, and all polymers eventually will start to allow water to pass through them. It's just sort of a nature of the polymer material. And so that is just a fundamental limitation to the lifetime. And now people are exploring different types of insulating materials, but again, this is kind of still early days for some of those new materials.
When these devices, Neuralink or others, are implanted, what's the expected lifespan or the useful period of those kind of devices?
Yeah, so I would say that the sample size is pretty limited. Right. So another company that's been in this space for 20 years or more is BlackRock, and they published a sort of a retrospective recently, or some researchers worked with them to publish a retrospective, and they looked at 14 patients that had been implanted. And their average lifespan was about, I believe it was like 2 to 3 years. So, that's a reasonable amount of time. But on the other hand, it does require brain surgery to put them in. So you probably don't want to have to replace these things every 2 to 3 years. Certainly, everyone's working to make these devices more robust, to improve the lifespan. And we have yet to see what a flexible electrode modality, such as the one that Neuralink used, what their longevity might be as opposed to these rigid devices. It may be shorter just because they are so tiny, but I don't know. And I'm not sure that anyone really knows yet.
It's a big unknown at this point.
Yeah, it's an unknown.
Just to shift gears a little, Cristin, and talk about what your lab studies here on campus. Could you just kind of give us kind of an encapsulated look at some of the main projects at your lab? It's called the Bioelectrics Lab, I believe, that you're working on here in the Department of Neurosurgery at the CU School of Medicine. What are a couple of your projects you like to highlight?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was at the FDA, we worked primarily on brain-computer interface technology. And so in my time here, I've done a little bit of work looking at long-term safety and performance of these microelectrodes that go in the brain. But more recently, my lab has switched its focus from the devices that can record from brain signals to devices that can apply electrical current to the brain to help to change brain activity. And that's kind of a space that's called neuromodulation. And we're really interested in how stimulating actually the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that travels throughout your body. It connects your brain to almost all of your internal organs. And it can be electrically stimulated, and it has some really interesting effects. It can help reduce seizures in patients with epilepsy. It can improve depressive scores in patients with depression. And it also seems to drive plasticity in the brain so that it can help patients recover motor function that they've lost as a result of stroke. Or in our case, we're looking specifically at multiple sclerosis. We're very interested in exploring how vagus nerve stimulation might be able to both restore myelination in the brain and also recover lost motor function, which is actually something that is problematic for up to 75% of patients with MS. Are deficits in fine motor function. And so we've been working with the Hughes lab here on campus, who has expertise in MS, and we found some really exciting things that perhaps vagus nerve stimulation may help the brain to regenerate new oligodendrocytes, which are the cells that create myelin in the brain.
That's very interesting. So with your research, we've kind of done a full circle. That we started out talking about Neuralink, where it's essentially taking that brain output, trying to find a way of expressing that.
Right.
If I understand you correctly, you're adding more input to the brain to try to model and modulate things in that way. So you're getting both the input and the output covered here.
Yeah, and I think, the future vision for myself and many of us in the field is to combine those two things, right? So what would be really exciting is if you could listen to the brain, find out when something's going wrong, and then provide a little burst of the right stimulation to help fix it kind of in real time. And so right now, our stimulation that we apply is based on an outcome, but we're not listening to the brain, we're actually just looking at behavior. But it would be really cool if we could sort of bypass the behavioral outcome and just listen to what the brain is telling us and use that to drive the stimulation instead.
Yeah, it's so interesting to talk about the vagus nerve. I think it talks to the wandering nerve, or there's some sort of, in the very past, you would do vagotomies. You'd sever the vagus nerves for different ailments. I mean, very crudely, you'd cut the nerve, right, for peptic ulcer disease or gastritis and so forth. Now you're using that nerve and its distribution in these much more sophisticated ways.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's sort of an understudied and underappreciated sense. You know, we think of our bodily senses as touch and sight and smell, and those, of course, are senses. But actually, the vagus nerve is a major sensory nerve. 80% of vagal fibers are sensory, and they're just giving the brain a lot of information about what's going on in the body. And so there's been some cool studies showing that, like, when you activate fibers in the gut that might be activated by like a sweet or a fat, something rewarding, it actually drives activity in the reward centers of the brain, right? Which makes sense. You know, your body is constantly speaking to your brain and telling it about yourself, about your state. And so I think that actually there's a lot of power in the vagus nerve that has only been explored in the smallest way up till this point.
I mean, so there's been an appreciation for a long time of the importance of the nerve, and I think with the sophistication of technology, people like you thinking about this, there's much more nuance now on how to harness that.
That's right. That's right. And much more precision.
Much more precision.
Yeah.
I can't help but think about how, kind of in the more macro sense here, that you have companies that are moving ahead and innovating on the brain-computer interface front, and then you have a regulatory body back here that's like trying to get its arms around what's happening. Yeah. I mean, this kind of goes back to a little bit what we were talking about before, but it seems like there would be a real tension there. You've been in both worlds, right? The FDA, and now you're delving in on the more innovation side of the technologies. How does regulatory agencies keep up, or are they being left behind here?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think when I was at the FDA, I was running a research group there and also participating in the regulatory review process. And, you know, one of the ways that the FDA does sort of keep up, so to speak, is by having researchers in-house that have an understanding of these different types of technology and are conducting experiments, not on any one company's product, but more broadly to understand a kind of a category of technology. And so absolutely, the FDA has kind of a tough job. They have to balance safety. They want to make sure that patients are safe and informed about the types of trials that they're going to participate in. But they also want to promote innovation. And they have started a bunch of programs in the last 5 to 10 years that are really designed to help spur innovation. One of these is called the Breakthrough Devices Program, which allows companies to say that they're doing something really novel, and it gives them a little bit more face time with the FDA. They can talk more frequently and have more informal interactions. And there's been other programs, too, that have really, I think, helped move the field along. When I was at the FDA, one of my goals was to bring the scientific community and the regulators together. I hosted a couple of public workshops on brain-computer interface technology, and one of those workshops resulted in the framework for this guidance document that was then later published after I left the FDA, but was something that we started when I was there. And I think that the FDA has continued that work in large part. So I would say that most of the people I talk to now, although they may feel frustrated with the speed of the regulatory process, they also feel that the FDA appreciates pushing innovation forward. But it's still a tough job. And, one of the spaces that's really difficult and almost intractable for some neurotechnology is the insurance coverage. So even after you get approved by the FDA, you can sell your device here in the US. Getting reimbursement can be extremely daunting, and the Center for Medicaid Services, CMS, is very conservative when they make designations about insurance coverage. So that's actually been a breaking point for a number of neurotechnology companies recently.
It's really helpful to hear about your experience working in the FDA, working as a research in the FDA, and then working now in the research community. Just as a professional disclosure, as I've gone through my career and been to FDA workshops and done some visits to the FDA, you really have a respect for what they're doing there in the balance that they're taking on. And I agree. I think over the last number of years, you've seen them try to promote innovation in that balanced, very rational way. But your perspective, particularly in this field, is really great.
Yeah, thanks. And I think people ask me all the time, like, oh, do you think that Neuralink kind of got through the FDA because of who they are or because of who's backing them. And I always say, really no. I think the FDA holds everyone to the same standard. And as has been reported in the field, Neuralink was not able to get their approval for their clinical trial on the first try. They had to go back and redo their testing and really demonstrate that what they were doing was safe. And they've had some other bumps in the road, some issues with their animal experiments early on, and then of course this recent disclosure about these electrodes coming out. And so, but I think that the FDA's perspective is probably taking the balance of, what are the safety risks that can be posed by these sort of issues versus what are the benefits that could come to patients eventually, and then making an informed decision.
You've really covered this exceptionally well, Cristin, and thanks for offering a window into this world, because it's fascinating. You could talk about this for hours. But and you've touched on a few of these things already, but what would you say is the biggest challenge that's still out there facing this, say, BCI technology?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of challenges. There's technical challenges, right? And we've covered some of those. Making these devices last for a long period of time in the brain is really hard. But the other challenge is that we just don't understand the brain enough. I say that I've said sort of blithely that we can just decode these neural signals and figure out what the patient is thinking, but that is actually not particularly precise at this point in time, because a lot of neurons are doing have very complex signals, and we still don't really understand those. We also don't necessarily know the right parts of the brain to target. And so there's a host of animal studies that are going on trying to piece that apart, and they've gotten us really far along, but there's still a lot of unknowns, especially when you start talking about other conditions like neuropsychiatric conditions or other disorders that are not so clearly linked to a movement output. So I think understanding the brain is something that we need to continue to explore. And, it's exciting that on this campus we have some really great neural engineering groups, including Dan Kramer and John Thompson, who are doing work in human patients to understand how the brain is functioning. Dan Kramer is launching a brain-computer interface program here on campus, which is really exciting. And I think that kind of work needs to be done to really bring this technology to the place where it can reliably help the patients that it's aiming to help.
That sounds like a great future episode.
Yeah, I agree.
I would say this topic, though, I've gotten, kind of the neighbor question about this. What's this Neuralink thing? I see patients just unrelated to what I'm seeing them for. What do you think about it? There's just a lot of interest in this, and part of it is the media.
Yeah.
This is a tough question. You can completely, what's the right expectation for the general public 5 or 10 years down the road in this field? What's a reasonable expectation of what could be achieved or might be achieved?
Yeah, my prediction is that within 5 years, we'll see a commercialized brain-computer interface technology product. Now, whether it's a commercial success is harder to say if they're going to get the right insurance coverage. People are also a little wary of putting things in their brain. Understandably so, right? And so sometimes there's sort of there are those who are technology curious, but then there are other patients who would prefer to try other routes. I don't know what the future looks like or whether the first company to launch is going to be the one that really makes it all the way, but I think we'll see a product coming out that can help patients sometime soon. And I think with all of the different companies that are working towards commercialization, we're going to see rapid improvements in the quality of those products as the years go by. What I'd really love to see is more investment in the space and sort of more understanding of how the brain works, and also bringing patients into the process even more than they have been already. I sit on the scientific advisory board of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. We're pleased as the part of the foundation, we're pleased to be a part of a new collaborative community that's been launched called the Implanted Brain-Computer Interfaces Collaborative Community. It's an FDA commercial and scientific group where everyone's coming together. Neuralink is a part of it. Many other patient advocacy groups are part of it. BlackRock's in there, a bunch of researchers. And the goal is to bring the patient advocate, the patient perspectives, the commercial entities, and the researchers all together and help to talk through some of these problems with the FDA in the room and in the conversation so that we can help to work through some of the tricky technical issues and move this field forward a lot more quickly.
Well, props to you for navigating all these complex networks out there, both in the brain and the human soft side, and bringing all the different disciplines
different
together.
levels of networks.
Yeah, that's something to be applauded to have that initiative. So I think it's fascinating. Appreciate you sharing your expertise with us, Dr. Welle, and please keep up the good work, and we would love to hear more about this on a future episode.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation and your expertise in this area, and I agree. I'd love to hear more about your work that you're doing here in future episodes to make some additional advances there. Just fantastic.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you again so much for having me on, and I'd be happy to talk anytime. This was fun.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Health Science Radio is produced by the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Story editing, production, and design by the Office of Communications. A special thanks to Minnesota-based rock band Low for the permission to their song Especially Me for theme music. This has been Health Science Radio. Thanks for listening.